Welcome back to Combat Mission Cold War, where we're going to take a look at cluster munitions. What are they? How do they work? And most importantly, how effective are they? There are two broad ways of making long-range weapons like bombs, rockets, and artillery shells more effective: making them more accurate, or increasing their area of effect. Until relatively recently, it has been much easier to increase the area of effect than it has been to increase the accuracy. So shells and bombs have seen improved explosive fillers to create larger explosions, they've seen development in their outer cases to maximize fragmentation or blast, and they've seen improvements in fusing to make them detonate at the most effective altitudes. The issue with these methods is that they tend to increase the effectiveness of munitions in a very linear way. For example, if we throw a 155mm shell, we get a zone of overkill at ground zero and a surrounding area of decreasing effects. Improving the explosives, fragmentation pattern, or fusing simply increases the size of these zones. Direct hits or near misses are still required to destroy vehicles or infantry in foxholes or slit trenches. By the 1960s, however, all of these elements had developed and been miniaturized to the point that they could be combined into the cluster munition, a shell bomb or rocket that carries a payload of smaller submunitions and scatters them over a wide area. This means that we're no longer dealing with a single epicenter. Depending on the size of the projectile, we could be dealing with several hundred submunitions. Although the individual bomblets produce smaller, weaker areas of effect, direct hits and near misses are still effective, and lots of them result in broader and more even coverage of the target area. So instead of having a relatively small area of massive overkill surrounded by an area of decreasing lethality, cluster munitions offer a lower, but still effective, degree of lethality that is relatively equal across the whole area of effect. In other words, fewer individual munitions are needed to saturate an area, meaning that fire missions can take less time and use less ammunition, and that accuracy is less critical for effect on target. Unsurprisingly, cluster munitions were embraced by militaries the world over and steadily improved and refined. The main issue with cluster munitions, however, at least as seen in the West, is the UXO problem, or unexploded ordnance. Simply put, individual bomblets have a failure rate, and inevitably a percentage, sometimes a significant percentage, even up to 40% or more, of submunitions released do not explode as intended. They just sit there until they are either cleaned up and made safe, which is time-consuming, difficult, and expensive, or some unfortunate and probably entirely innocent individual disturbs them, potentially years down the line, and gets blown up. This is an obvious ethical issue, especially as development in precision-guided weapons like laser-guided bombs and GPS-guided artillery shells have resulted in weapons that are accurate enough to get the job done without needing the wide area of effect of cluster munitions, and don't come with the same kind of unexploded ordnance problem. So, in 2008, the use, development, production, stockpiling, and transferring of cluster munitions was banned by international treaty, the Convention on Cluster Munitions. There have so far been 111 signatories to the convention, with the notable exceptions of Russia, China, and the United States. That's the background. In a combat mission context, cluster munitions are currently only available in Combat Mission Cold War. They can be delivered by air or artillery and come in two types: Icm and Dp Icm. Icm stands for Improved Conventional Munition, and the bomblets produce straight high explosive and fragmentation effects. In-game, this type of ammunition is used by Soviet cluster artillery. Dp Icm stands for Dual Purpose Improved Conventional Munition. These are slightly more complicated bomblets, incorporating a small-shaped charge warhead that provides each individual submunition with a degree of anti-armor capability. US artillery and air support, as well as some Soviet air support, use Dp Icm in Combat Mission Cold War. Different shells and bombs can carry different numbers of bomblets that might be different sizes. For example, a cluster artillery shell from a US M114A 155mm howitzer distributes 80 plus small Dp Icm submunitions. A Soviet D-20 152mm howitzer, on the other hand, distributes 7 larger ICM submunitions. so there can be significant differences between artillery ammunition, even if the actual guns or howitzers are roughly comparable. As a rule, air-delivered cluster munitions generally contain a larger number of larger submunitions than their artillery counterparts, which makes sense because bombs are bigger than shells. But at least at the moment in combat mission, aircraft will only drop a single bomb per pass. This means that artillery firing cluster munitions will almost always deliver considerably more firepower into the target area than air-dropped cluster bombs in a given time span. Finally, on the technical side, combat mission does not simulate unexploded ordnance, so all the submunitions will detonate and you don't need to worry about duds. This leads us on to the effectiveness of cluster munitions as modelled in Combat Mission Cold War. It's worth noting that it is currently early days. The game hasn't been out that long at this point, so these are my initial impressions after only a few battles and a bit of testing. The most important takeaway is that cluster artillery and cluster bombs are more effective than unitary artillery and bombs, especially against armoured targets. There is a pretty strong argument that artillery is underperforming against armoured targets in combat mission. Tanks caught in artillery barrages don't seem to incur the kind of subsystem damage that they should, so the arrival of Dp Icm goes a long way to making artillery effective against tanks and lightly armoured vehicles, which is obviously a bit of a game changer. The flip side is that cluster munitions are not some kind of wonder weapon. Those 80 plus Dp Icm bomblets per 155mm shell might look devastating, but against well dispersed or mobile targets they're not only not guaranteed to score many hits, but the small size of the bomblets limits the effectiveness of the shaped charge used to attack armoured targets, so it's probably going to take multiple hits to destroy a Soviet tank. They are going to inflict subsystem damage and you might get lucky. Plus, again, this is better than unitary artillery. But I think a fast-moving, well spread out enemy force has a good chance of getting through any cluster barrage you put up. Air-delivered cluster munitions are a little different because the aircraft is actually aiming them at whatever enemy they've chosen to engage, so they're better against moving targets, but because they just drop that single bomb per pass, there's less overall firepower coming down. So overall, I'd say cluster munitions in Combat Mission Cold War are better than regular artillery, but they still have important limitations that you need to be aware of if you want to use them to best effect. There is definitely scope for them to be added to the other modern titles, Shock Force and Black Sea, via an engine upgrade, which would certainly add a new dimension to those games. And that's it for this video, just a quick overview of how cluster munitions work. Hope you found it useful, and I'll see you in the next one.